So, were you, so when you came to Berkeley in '64, there had been a history of the loyalty oath here at Berkeley that's, I think, had a significant residue.
Right.
Maybe you should tell us a little bit about the loyalty oath controversy here at Berkeley and then how you encountered it when you came.
Well, I had my career as a left labor youth organizer ended in 1956, but as late as 1964, I was still running into job problems as a result of that. For example, I was offered a major jobs at University of the State of New York and also at Pittsburgh because of some work that I had done as a postdoc in San Diego. And what happened was that I got jobs, I got offered, I got wined and dined in the typical academic manner, and then when it came time to go to the job, the equivalents of our Board of Regents in these universities turned me down based on loyalty oaths, which later were called unconstitutional. And of course, there was a big fight on loyalty oath in California, which resulted in a lot of people being fired and later reinstated. And the oath itself was sharply modified after the Supreme Court threw out the worst aspects of the loyalty oaths nationally. Mm-hmm. And when I was due to get my job, when I was due to come to the University of California, at San Diego, there was this oath, which was that you don't want to overthrow the government of the state of California by force and violence, something to that effect. And I guess I signed that, which I guess everybody who's an employee does. And so, anyway, I got to the university, but before I got my appointment, sure enough, the same problem came up in California, and the regents delayed the appointment. I would have been here in June of '64, but I got here in August because the regents were concerned. And actually, I got here and was accepted and got a position as associate professor only because professors on this campus and also in San Diego intervened very strongly with the Board of Regents in defense of my academic freedom, so I'm beholden to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good, yeah. Can you say something about the department you came to and how the effect of the loyalty oath played out in that department when you arrived?
Yes, actually, the department I came to at that time was called the Department of Bacteriology. It combined the disciplines of bacteriology, microbiology, immunology, and my area was biochemistry and immunology. The department had been very sharply divided, not only as a result of the loyalty oath, but as a result of long-standing differences that around the question of research, where some of the members of the department in the immunology phase have been actively involved with the Naval Biological Lab, which did experiments in defense, or however you want to look at it, of germ warfare, including releasing microbes from offshore San Francisco to watch how they would come. And there were members of my department before I got here who were very much opposed to that. Mm-hmm. And strangely enough, when I got here, maybe because of my background or perhaps despite it, I was sort of the unifier, and I unified by reaching agreement with both sides to split the department, something that could well be done in a number of countries today, instead of fighting a civil war.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that was there. So the loyalty oath was a very big thing, which everybody knew about, even though it had already been largely resolved by the time I got to Berkeley. And a number of the people who were very active ultimately in defense of the students and of the free speech movement were people who themselves had been fired because of the loyalty oath and then rehired. So it was a very strong element in the consciousness of the Berkeley faculty before the free speech movement ever started.
Yeah. Could you say something about Clark Kerr's past history and involvement with the loyalty oath and how he came to be president? Is that part of?
That's not really what I feel that I can contribute very much on. I think, as you know, Clark Kerr was a very staunch liberal and played a very major role in the expansion of education in California, and everybody knew that before I got here. Unfortunately, it sort of came a cropper during some of the struggles over loyalty oath and ultimately over the free speech movement. But the paradox, if you want to call it that, as you know from some of the material that's come out since, is that when the free speech movement developed, it turns out that Governor Reagan and J. Edgar Hoover had colluded to get rid of Clark Kerr. So there was an interesting situation in which the students regarded Clark Kerr as a major enemy of free speech because of the fact that he represented authority in that period. And on the other hand, he was regarded as the biggest enemy of the FBI, who had no place in the university. Life gets very complicated, as you can tell looking around at what's happening in the world today.
Yes, yes. And what was your impression of Clark Kerr when you started here?
Well, when I started here, I was glad that the majority of the regents with Clark Kerr's support supported my appointment and didn't carry on the old sort of Cold War antagonisms. I had very little to do with them personally. I had one encounter during the free speech movement, which I've written about, which was not a direct encounter. That is, I got word on the eve, actually, of the famous Greek theater event where Mario Savio was arrested or manhandled. I got word either earlier that day or the day before, I'm not sure which, that there was a new chancellor acting on the Berkeley campus, and he wanted to see me. That is, there had been no official announcement, but actually there was an acting chancellor other than Strong. And he called me in. He said he called me in at the request of Clark Kerr, that because of my experience in radical youth movements, I might have some advice to give. Well, I was flattered, and I gave advice, and my advice was that the administration should come around and support what the faculty had come up with at that point, which turned out to be the basis for the agreement that finally was achieved, which was a victory for the free speech movement. And I was very happy about it. Later that day, I went to see the member of the faculty, who was also a member of the administration, who had arranged the appointment, not the chancellor, not the acting chancellor, but the one who had arranged the appointment. And I went to tell him the good news, and went to his house, and he said, "Leon, I'm very disappointed in you. We don't know how to deal with Mario Savio. he talks the language of the gutter, and we thought you could help us deal with it. Well, as you can imagine, that was not my impression of Mario Savio, and it was not something that I could take without getting very angry. I turned around and left, and I got effusive apologies for the next 24 to 36 hours. I remained friends with that person. But it showed the mood that existed on the part of a conservative section of the faculty, which felt besieged and couldn't adjust to the fact that there was a new generation that had a new experience and that wasn't prepared to simply follow in the mold that was set out for them. And I think, what particularly strikes me in looking back at it was when you listen to Mario Savio's speeches. Mario became a very good friend of mine eventually. And when you listen to his marvelous way of speaking and thinking, and you think to yourself that the mood at that time was that this is some kind of a thug or a pseudo-communist or what have you. It was a mood of not listening. And eventually that makes the breakthrough that took place enormously significant.
Yes. Yes, let's talk a little bit about Mario Savio and the speeches. This faculty member who approached you, first of all, how old was he at that time? Was he older than you? Was he of a different generation?
I think the fact of the matter is that he probably was older. Most of the people from that generation are gone.
Yes.
I'm an outlier.
Yes.
So I think he was older than I.
Yeah, but you weren't so young yourself, right? You were 44. You weren't like a youth.
No, that's right. I had two careers, so.
Yes.
Actually, I was a novice in the new career, but I got my PhD when I was 41 years old. I didn't go back to school, to graduate school, until I was 37.
Yes.
So, yes, I was not one of the youth of the free speech movement.
Yes. Maybe that was one of the reasons he turned to you. But so back to the faculty member and the other ones who were afraid of the new generation. Do you think they had actually listened to any of Mario's speeches?
I think in general what happened originally on the part of the faculty is that very few of the faculty members appreciated what was happening initially. When the car was surrounded, there were a few faculty members, I think John Searle in the first place, who got up on the car and recognized what was happening, and especially appreciated what the nature of the controversy was at that point, because these students had come, as is well known now, from the heroic freedom voting movement in the South that summer, and were certainly idealistic, impassioned, and not ready to simply drop their beliefs and their right to speak simply because of institutional rules and regulations. So but most of the faculty, as in most critical situations, there's a certain distance that characterizes a faculty. And I think for the most part the feeling was it'll blow over. It'll come to a head. And if not, Clark Kerr and so on will figure out a way to handle it. So I think initially most of the faculty was simply inert. Right. Anyway, there were a few faculty members, in addition to John Searle, in particular people who became my dearest, closest friend, both of whom are gone now, died young. They were younger than I. That's Reggie Zelnick and Larry Levine of the history department. And I made close friends with them at that time, although personally, especially because of my political background, I didn't plunge right in. I sort of was reserved in my approach to it, although from the very beginning I was certainly supportive of the students.
Can you remember some of the conversations you had with Reggie Zelnick and
Yeah,
Lawrence
we
Levine?
talked every day. I mean, I think we were on the same page from the very beginning.
What were the issues for them?
The issue was free speech. The issue was precisely the issue that students and the university were not in an ivory tower, and part of being a good student, or for that matter, as it turns out, a good faculty member, was to be concerned with your community, with your country, with what goes on in the world, and not to view being in the university as a vacation from life. So that's the fundamental issue. And it's quite interesting that generation after generation, it's frequently the young people who kick over the traces and bring about change. So to operate on the basis that young people have to be a silent generation and shut up actually goes not against the young people, but it goes against the whole way in which a country or a university refreshes itself and gets new ideas. So that was our outlook at the time. Anyway, that all changed when the administration remained very obstinate. Chancellor Strong in the first place, and particularly when the major events took place of the occupation of Sproul Hall and the eventual arrests. And that was the point at which the faculty went into shock and, to their credit, recognized that the fight was a good fight, that they should be part of it. And at that point, I would say a majority of the faculty moved over to the side of the students, ultimately culminating in the Committee of 200 and the plan that it put forward that served as a basis for an overwhelming vote in the Academic Senate that represented the victory of the free speech movement.
So just to think a minute about the effect of the sit-in itself, can you remember your response or other faculty's response to
Yes,
the
I can
sit-in
remember.
itself?
I can remember being right outside Sproul Hall as they were, right after they had dragged the students out, with another professor, Howard Schachman, who had been one of the people who fought the loyalty oath. And the two of us saw what was happening, and we decided that there was need for an emergency meeting, and we actually called the meeting that resulted in the formation of the Committee of 200. It took place in the Life Sciences building, the old Life Sciences building, and got a big turnout. And it was, from that point on, the forum that really altered the position that the faculty took and paved the way for the final outcome. Actually, the very first meeting of the Academic Senate, an emergency meeting, which took place after it, the very first resolution in criticism of the administration's position was one put by the chairman of my department, who was an outstanding microbiologist, Roger Stanier. And one of the first voices that were raised was Larry Levine, who was a young assistant professor at that time, and who was actually put down because, you know, the academic senate can sometimes be a very self-satisfied, stuffy place. And a young upstart speaking is not always a voice that's heard. But Larry spoke, and he was one of the first and most courageous that made the position clear. So it was an uphill battle, but it turned very dramatically when the arrest took place.
Mm-hmm. What?
And it turned even more dramatically, of course, because at that point, a lot of the faculty still thought that Clark Kerr.
She stopped it for a second, but.
Questions too, by the way.
Yeah.
So you're about
Where
to
was
say,
I?
well, you're about to say that what changed the mood of
Yeah,
the faculty? First, the police. Do you
Yes.
think it was the shock of seeing the students treated
Absolutely.
so badly by the police?
Absolutely. Because what that did was simply underscore what the significance of the dispute was. If you could bring police on campus and drag your students out, faculty, after all, had a certain bond with students, even though it's sometimes rather official, but it's also human. It's a bond of people you work with, people you see. And there was, shock is the right word. It was a real shock to see your students dragged out like that by masses of police that came from all over the Berkeley area, the East Bay. And which, by the way, was the forerunner of a period of considerable violence that went on for years, where it was a matter of form, even after the victory of the free speech movement, that when there's a crisis, you turn to the police, you turn to the National Guard. It's sort of a similar approach to controversy that unfortunately plagues the world today.
Yes, yes. And did the side of the police manhandling the students, did it raise questions for the faculty of where they stood? Like,
yes, it
in
did.
between all
The
these?
faculty went out, a lot of faculty went to Santa Rita, bailed out students, supported them all the way through. And a lot of it was faculty with their own students. It wasn't just in general. It's they went out to see their people who had been arrested, their graduate students or undergraduates. So it made a tremendous difference. Although the final turning point came at the Greek Theater. And that's where, once again, while supposedly the atmosphere was one of dialogue and discussion, that wasn't supposed to embrace the free speech movement. That wasn't supposed to be one that allowed another voice, just the voice of officialdom. And when Mario challenged that and was mobbed by police, not mobbed, just a couple of police, excuse the exaggeration. But anyway, the point again of the intervention of treating free speech and demand for free speech by simply demanding silence and force, I think that's what finally really swung the tide. I mean, you know, that's a historic vote. That wasn't a vote by a small margin. If I recall, it was, something like 700 to...
It was 824 to 115.
824 to 115. So that was big.
Yeah. Do you remember what some of the arguments were in favor of the proposition that passed? Do you remember the debate?
I think I've indicated in terms of my own thinking what they are. I think there was a very strong feeling that there should be no restrictions on free speech in the university that were beyond the restrictions on free speech in society in general. What the arguments were at that time is that you could establish norms, what were called I forget the terminology, what was, for keeping a sort of orderly campus, you could establish norms for that without abusing free speech. And I think that was the fundamental attitude.
So, was there deep, was there any soul searching on the part of these faculty members about what kind of institution is the university? Is it
Okay.
for thought, or is it?
Well, that's a good question, because once the mood changed, people were listening. For example, the attitude toward Mario and his talk about not being a part of the institution,
the
machine and so on,
multiversity.
it began to register. And the respect for him and for the students generally went up very considerably. That was inevitable. So it wasn't just the question of Big Brother on the faculty defending the helpless students. It was a matter of beginning to listen to what was being said. And it had an impact on the faculty, on a large section of the faculty. I mean, obviously the faculty, like the student body, is heterogeneous. But there was a major section of the faculty for whom that whole fight was a turning point in regard to their attitude toward their own relation to the university and to society. And you had faculty who were standing up against the war in Vietnam in support of students, faculty who opposed the efforts to eliminate People's Park and bring in the National Guard, faculty, myself included, who were prepared to directly challenge Governor Reagan, which we did in Sacramento. So it was a significant shift, and one which I guess is a principle that, you know, there may not be equality of knowledge in your subject of expertise, but there is equality in the society and equality of responsibility.
Yeah. We did an interview with Bettina Apteker earlier, and she recalls watching the Academic Senate members coming out of the meeting, which they had voted to support the students, and seeing faculty members crying.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if that's something that you notice if you have an interpretation of why they were crying.
Yeah, well, you know, I was going to mention that before. It's an interesting point, because there was a feeling of elation. I mean, you know, it wasn't just that the mood shifted, that the cause became theirs, at least on the part of a large section of faculty. So the victory wasn't just a victory for somebody else, it was a victory for very basic ideals and beliefs that were being joined in this battle. And I remember that very well. I mean, you know, in a certain sense, you know, maybe faculty shouldn't have taken as much credit as it did, because it came in as sort of Johnny-come-latelys for the most part. But still, it got there, and it did what it was supposed to do. It did the good fight, as Reggie Zelnick called it in his book. And they felt pride. They were excited. They were elated. Human beings, after all.
Yeah. And did it change your relations with some of the faculty?
Oh, yes, yes. You know, one of the things that did for the campus generally, and certainly for me, was that regardless of all the disruptions that were inevitably part of that and subsequent struggles on campus, the impact of those things was to break down parochialism, to break down what is a very paralyzing aspect of academic life, you know, where each is in their own cubbyhole. So that, for example, my best friends were not just in science and biology, they were in history, they were in English, They were in art. In that sense, it's often overlooked. But that did something for the idea of the university that was really quite important. It's a place of learning, not just a place of expertise. It was a place of community. So yes, I made many friends. People could respect each other. In terms of my own background, even though I came under very sharp attack from what was the equivalent in those days of the third part of the Tea Party, that is the John Birch Society and its equivalent in this area, that tried to make me and Bettina Apteker, by the way, the targets for smearing the whole movement because we had a radical background. I mean, they wanted the message to be that this is all a communist plot. In fact, as you probably know, the House Un-American Committee came out with a report, I guess in March, the year after the free speech movement, in which the main person they blamed for the whole thing was me, that I came by way of San Diego. And this was before I even knew anybody on the Berkeley campus, because, you know, to some extent, even though ideologically and culturally I was with the students from the beginning, I too was a Johnny-come-lately. I didn't plunge into the battle whole hog until the rest of us did. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's part of the picture. But after that, I would say, you know, they did something else for me, because I was self-conscious about my background, not apologetic about it, even though I changed my mind, which I had the absolute right to do about many things that I believed as a young person. But I wasn't at all apologetic about thinking for myself what I had done, how I spent my life. Nevertheless, the whole impact of McCarthyism, loyalty oaths, were one where you felt a little bit like a pariah. And that influenced my own behavior to some extent. And the students did me a heck of a big favor by sort of putting all that stuff aside and getting to what really counts. So it really changed my relationships, not just with students, but with a lot of the faculty. And I made very, very good friends. I'll give you an example of what that was. The People's Park thing, which took place later, I wasn't part of that. I just wasn't gung-ho, maybe partly because of my background. I wasn't gung-ho about the post-hippie aspects of the thing. Nevertheless, I was very much opposed to the violence with which it was met. And we organized a group of faculty, there were 17 of us, that went up to Sacramento after the tear gassing and the helicopters and the National Guard was on the Berkeley campus. And after Rector had been killed and another person blinded. And it was a year before Kent State. And we were genuinely concerned of what ultimately did happen at Kent State. So we went up to Sacramento, and we didn't go up to see the governor because we thought that was so hopeless. But we looked for people who might be able to talk reason and sanity in what was an insane situation. Well, we got word that the governor knew we were there and he wanted to see us. So we went into his chamber and found a whole battery of cameras from every news organization in the world. And he came in, although he has a reputation for not using makeup, I remember him as coming in ready for the cameras. And I sat in the back, partly because of my reserve. I knew that my background was known. I knew that when I first came to California, J. Edgar Hoover sent a letter to then Governor Brown that I was on my way, as if God knows what I would do in California. So I was reserved, and I sat in the back, and the delegation included some very major faculty, and I was sort of a new faculty member, and I figured I'd keep quiet. Well, what happened is that Reagan began to lecture us without hearing anything and give you eggheads, he didn't use that word, but essentially, you are responsible for telling your students that they could break the law and so on and so forth. And it looked like a very sorry situation because the cameras were grinding, and clearly this was an effort to really paint the faculty as eggheads and so on. So I had no choice. I was in the back, but I piped up. And I said, that's a very fine speech for politics, but we came here to try to see if we can get some sanity in a very difficult situation. Well, what ensued was a very sharp exchange between me and Reagan, in which he did know who I was and made that very clear. But the whole situation turned. Other members of the faculty joined in, particularly Owen Chamberlain, and it really turned the situation around. Now, if I had kept quiet, it would have been different. But I had to, based on experience, show the kind of guts that the students had shown. And so it was a lesson. And in a sense, they freed me. They liberated me. And the result of that confrontation, by the way, was the best press in opposition to Reagan that we had ever had. Of course, we may have been responsible for his eventually becoming president, but at that point, we got a tremendous amount of favorable publicity around the world for challenging a governor who was using violence on the campus that had no more place here than it would have in Czechoslovakia or anywhere else in the world, or France. So anyway,
Yeah.
I owe a lot to the FSM.
Yeah. Well,
Have you read the Pearlstein books?
What?
Have you read those books? I keep telling her to read them. The Rick Pearlstein books, like he's written 3 about the history of conservatism, like from Goldwater to Nixon to Reagan. And he has the 3rd one that's just come out about Reagan, which I'm very excited to read. Anyway, I forget what it's like, something, The Bridge? I forget what it's called, but
I think so.
but it's supposed to be
The
great.
New York Times had a review of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry,
Yeah.
go on.
Yeah, no. So Mario Savio, I mean, you're maybe you can tell us more because it sounds like you got to know him, and his influence. I guess one question, reading all this information, I wondered what the FSM's chances would have been if there hadn't been Mario Savio at the forefront of the movement.
Well, that's an impossible question. It may be a good question, but it's impossible to answer. The fact of the matter is, when movements get going, it might have been somebody else other
That's
than
true.
Mario Savio. You don't know. Sometimes when you really need a voice like a Mario Savio, which we need damn well today in this country, no such voice appears, and that's unfortunate. But the fact is that those voices appear when there is a groundswell of movement, and who knows, maybe others without the eloquence of Mario. There were others, there were a lot. There was Bettina Aptic herself. If Mario were alive today, this wouldn't all be about Mario. He would never allow it. That wasn't his personality. He saw himself as a part. He had agreements, he had disagreements. There were ideas and tactics that he presented which turned out to be wrong. And other people, there were a lot of smart people involved and a lot of idealistic people. And they fed each other. And Mario was outstanding. I mean, he rose above the crowd, no question about it. But I don't think the free speech movement, I think it does a disservice to it. It's like the civil rights movement is Martin Luther King. You know, it's really, if you look at the documentaries of the Freedom Summer and the heroic role of so many people in that, then, you know, it doesn't alter your appreciation of Martin Luther King, but it puts it in a context that's much more meaningful and hopeful. And so I find that hard to answer. My own relationship with Mario began when I spoke at a faculty meeting against the use of police force. And he came up to me after with tears in his eyes, and the first thing he said to me is, "Are you Italian?" Because I spoke with passion at in an academic setting where passion is not exactly the best currency. So anyway, we became very good friends eventually, right up to and including the time of his death, because Mario became very active again in the opposition to the propositions against immigrants and against free speech, and rather against affirmative action. And he and a couple of others, including myself, actually formed a committee that was very active in the days not long before his death.
Yeah. Were there certain words or concepts that he introduced that struck you at the time or stayed with you?
Sure. Now, I think what struck me about him was not a word here or there, but what struck me about him was the integrity of his whole persona and of his speech. That is, you couldn't always predict what his opinion would be, but you knew that it would be his opinion, thoughtful, based on values, human values, based on an integral kind of decency that you wish were common, and unfortunately isn't all that common. So he was very thoughtful and very probing. For example, he could embrace Marxist ideas, some of them, and not be a Marxist, and be as critical of some Marxist ideas as others that he would support. He was very hard to pigeonhole. He couldn't be pigeonholed. He had his own way of thinking and working things out. He was a scholar, by the way. He knew a hell of a lot. He read a hell of a lot. And as you know, what ultimately he achieved was pretty much more as a philosopher and a poet in his academic career than as any particular discipline. That's the area in which his thinking really shone.
Yeah. Do you want to ask?
No. Okay, you're too
Enough?
good.
Yeah. Well, I guess you could talk a little bit more about what happened after the free speech movement, and because you talked about how there was a sort of liberation of the faculty in a way.
Well, for a period of about, I would say, almost 10 years, maybe not a full 10 years, the mood of the faculty was pretty much influenced by what I would call the following of the Committee of 200. That is, there was an active, sort of progressive, socially conscious faculty that engaged. Not all of them engaged on every issue. For example, while a lot of them engaged in the fight against the Vietnam War, some of them didn't engage on the fight to recognize ethnic studies and the Third World Strike. In other words, it isn't as if you can deal with this as a single stream. It wasn't that. But in general, there was a progressive social consciousness that influenced the academic senate for a period of close to 10 years. I guess there is a residue of it now, and it seems to be reemerging to some extent, in part in the recognition of the 50th anniversary of the free speech movement. But unfortunately, what tends to happen is the inertia of institutions. I would say after that 10-year period, things sort of settled back into the sort of institutional kind of routine, which seems to be shaking up a little bit again. As far as your earlier question about what happened in the aftermath, the most important thing that followed was the Vietnam War. And there was a faculty peace committee that was very active, along with the students. And we did one thing together with the students, that is, we ran a Vietnam commencement at the height of the fight against the Vietnam War, in which graduating seniors, some 800 of them, pledged not to fight in Vietnam. And the faculty took their pledges and pledged to stand with them and defend them. And we organized a commencement around that called the Vietnam Commencement. Well, Governor Reagan decided, and the regents, that it couldn't take place, that it was illegal, that it was unpatriotic, and so on, and very threatening stuff. The result was that it took place. Some 10,000 people poured out. It was one of the biggest, it was as big as any of the big demonstrations of the free speech movement. 300 faculty stood at the podium on Sproul Steps in support of the students, in support of the event. Hutchison spoke from the University of Chicago, a number of others. It was a remarkable event, and even though it took place in the face of threats, no punishment took place. It just happened, and no campus administration that would have cracked down on the faculty or students could have gotten away with it at that point. Mm-hmm. So this is part of a legacy of the free speech movement. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, the free speech movement didn't change the world, although some of its people feel that their whole life revolved around it. Mm-hmm. It didn't change the world. I guess if by certain measures you could say we may be worse off in some respects now than we were then. Some respects better, but also in some respects worse. But the fact is that it did what its generation could do, and it did have an impact. It impacted the cultural norms of society in a very big way. There's no question that society is freer and looser, and if you look at women's rights, if you look at gay rights, certainly, even though the free speech movement itself might have been primitive in those respects, and was, still its spirit did influence the culture in very major ways.
Yes, yes. I'm just
Sorry to
resetting it.
interrupt. It
No.
reached the end of its
What?
It reached the end of its 29 minutes. So she took a second.
Okay, it seems like hours.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Are you tired? We can stop
No, that's
there.
all right.
Yeah. No, you were mentioning about what happened afterwards, and you mentioned Europe, etc. I mean, at the time, did you see some kind of a connection between what had happened here on the campus in the free speech movement and then what happened in Paris and Prague?
Definitely. I think there's no question that the free speech movement sparked similar movements everywhere. They developed their own form, and so the free speech movement can't claim credit for them. But very definitely the free speech movement emboldened and encouraged similar movements everywhere. First of all, on our own campuses, Stanford, Columbia. I visited Michigan State at that time to give a seminar and saw a similar movement there, Wisconsin. But beyond that, internationally, certainly the movements that took place in 1968 in France were very much influenced. They went beyond. They were much more political in character in terms of society in general. But certainly the spirit was one that was a wave that started with the free speech movement. And it also extended to movements in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. Right. So good. Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
Just the particular issue of free speech nor the issue of civil rights or so on. He was interested in education, the nature of education, as you can tell from his speeches. And I think that did have a major impact eventually on the way the faculty saw him and the respect he eventually gained among the faculty. None of those things change the fact that while the university is influenced by society, and the university can influence society, basically the university is part of society, and whatever the society decides it needs, whether it's technology or it's or whatever it is, the university feeds it, there's no question. So the better the society is, the better the university can be, and vice versa.
Yeah. Well,
All right.
you have to go. Yeah. I